Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the California State Library for this special program on Disneyland and the rise of automation with Professor Roland Betancourt. We at the State Library are thrilled to have Professor Betancourt presenting today's program. My name is Stephanie Manansala. I'm your host, and I am the supervising librarian of the Information Services section at the California State Library. Our moderator today is Mona Robinson. She's a supervising librarian in the Government Publications section, and she will be monitoring our Q&A section for any questions you may have, and will read your questions during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And finally, I would like to extend our deepest gratitude to the California State Library Foundation for their generous support of this program today and every day. Before we start the program, I have a bit of housekeeping to go over. Okay. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them, as I said, into the Q&A box, and we'll answer as many of them as we can at the end of the program. This presentation is being recorded and made available on the California State Library's YouTube channel. We will email the recording link to everyone who registered. Live transcription is enabled. Click the CC icon to show the captions. If you run into any technical difficulties during the presentation, please put those in the Q&A section, and we will do our best to resolve the issue for you. And we will put links, in fact, they may already be in there, related to the California State Library and Professor Betancourt's work in the chat window, particularly related to this evening's program. The California State Library has a patent and trademark resource center available to the public to answer questions about patents and trademarks, and for one-on-one consultations by appointment, both online and in person. More information is available at the link. Okay, and now that the housekeeping's out of the way, let's get to this evening's program. Professor Roland Betancourt is a scholar of Byzantium and modern popular culture with research at the intersection of the histories of science and technology, intellectual history, and the history of art. His academic distinctions include Andrew W. Mellon Professor at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art. He's a 2023 Guggenheim Fellow, Chancellor's Fellow of the Art History Department at UC Irvine, and Elizabeth and J. Richardson Dilworth Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University. His most recent book, Disneyland and the Rise of Automation: How Technology Created the Happiest Place on Earth, was just released yesterday, April 28th, 2026. Please join me in welcoming Professor Betancourt.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be able to share this work with you all, especially as the book just came out yesterday. So it's a very celebratory moment to be able to share a little bit, give you a glimpse of the project, and also talk a little bit about how it came to be and so on. So I am just going to share my screen so that we can get all the great images on here. And we can begin. So I will begin by saying that I am, as was said, I'm an art historian. And so this project really began in an interesting way. I thought, especially as a UC Irvine professor, that I wanted to work on something in the area that was somehow local, and Disneyland seemed to be a great option. I am a Floridian, and so therefore I grew up going to Walt Disney World. So I had sort of theme parks in the blood, not just Disney. But I thought that this would be a great place of thinking about a project that could be really historically grounded and situated in the realities of Southern California. And that's really how it began. As a medievalist, I thought that this project would take me into maybe the more expected areas, like thinking about medieval castles and theming, especially as an art historian. But this really sort of grew into a project to think about the history of automation and technology. And sort of a little bit of what I want to do here tonight is also give you a sense of how this project sort of came together, particularly by giving you a sort of history of the conversations around automation in the period that Disneyland was coming onto the scene. And so I begin this story in the book and here today with the Ford factory in Dearborn, Michigan. In particular, I want to highlight a trip that Walt Disney and one of his animators, Ward Kimball, whom you see on the screen on the right, took to the Ford factory. They were actually going to the Chicago Railroad Fair in 1948 in August to see the fair because they both had a huge interest in railways and trains. And so they went together. They took a train all the way to Chicago. And from there, they also took a day trip to the Ford factory. Now, this trip has always been described as being really fundamental in how Disney was thinking about the theme park. He basically came back and wrote the memo that sketched out what Disneyland could be, would be. And this is a really interesting moment because we tend to put a lot of emphasis on what they saw at a place like the Chicago Railroad Fair, also the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, which Walt Disney really loved and had a long association with, and also what they saw at Greenfield Village, which was a part of the Ford factory, essentially. It was part of their campus where they had the Edison Institute and had a sort of reconstruction of a sort of turn of the century American village. But what I'm showing you on the screen is really the huge sprawl of the Ford factory. And what I'm really highlighting in this book is the way that a lot of what Disneyland was able to do happened because of the automation technologies that were coming of age in this period and being given this name automation, as well as the ongoing conversations and development of these technologies really over the next 3 to 4 decades. And so we have this wonderful account by Ward Kimball of what he saw when he entered the Ford factory from his diary later that day, where he wrote, "What a sight! Miles upon miles of endless moving part belts, and men, black and white, and women assembling the engines, just like Chaplin's modern times. It floored me. We later walked the entire assembly line and watched the Fords roll off at the end." And I'm showing you in particular this image, which is almost contemporaneous with their visit to the factory. And so it really gives you a sense of what they were seeing when they were there at the Ford, at the River Rouge plant. And what I really love about the River Rouge in particular is that if anyone thought of American industry at the time, the River Rouge was really the model for that. It was this huge factory. It sort of demonstrated all these ideas of Fordism and the assembly line that we've come to associate with American manufacturing. And it really was a towering place that in this period was really in a state of rehab because it was coming out of the effort for World War II. And so it was really in a state of disrepair. And Disney was coming into this moment at the factory, coming to this visit right when they had actually started just the year before their Department of Automation, which is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, use of the term automation. And so what they saw was really fascinating because not only did they get a sort of behind the scene sneak peek at what the factory was like, since its opening, the Ford factory was designed not just, of course, as a working factory, but as a tourist attraction. You can see in my book these great images of the various types of maps that they produce for the factory, giving you a sort of guided tour of the experience. They also had these wonderful tour buses that actually had glass ceilings so you could see everything around you as you drove through the factory. And in this image from 1939, which is from a film of the tour of the factory, you can really see the people getting up close and personal with the blast furnaces. And what I really perhaps love the most about this still from the movie is the railing that you can see here, where you can see that there was this whole infrastructure to welcome guests into the factory. And as they walked through the factory, the idea was that visitors could actually understand how basically molten ore went from that state, from raw materials into a finished automobile. And here you have them, the tour group going through the factory as the chassis is being lowered onto the car right before they actually roll off the line. So it was really a very immersive space in a way that I think for Disney also spoke about the possibilities of what his theme park could look like. And factory tours were a real fascination. They were a part of the World's Fairs. They were really a critical part of a lot of the sources that Disney was looking at and thinking about to create Disneyland. And so this trip really was impactful for Walt Disney. As I said, he came back and basically drafted a memo that outlined what Disneyland essentially could look like when it was originally planned to be on a small lot across the street from the studio in Burbank. And you can just see from some of these comparisons of what they saw, for example, at the Railroad Fair in Chicago on the left, and of course the entrance to Frontierland that would eventually be built. The similarities are quite striking. Fun fact, the Museum of Science and Industry even had a Main Street exhibit that really is sort of the blueprint for the Main Street that we know and love today. And this image I find particularly sort of striking because this is a comparison of two different things. One is a Sulani steamboat at Greenfield Village, that of course they saw when they went to their visit at the Ford factory. And on the right, of course, you have the Mark Twain that would eventually be built for Disneyland. And so you really have a trip that was extremely influential. But until now, we've really thought about this trip as merely presenting Walt Disney with a set of visual sort of architectures, tropes, ideas about what theming could look like in these examples. We really haven't thought about what automation really offered Walt Disney in this moment as, the 50s were about to dawn. And so, what I want to begin by asking, and what I do in the book, is really lay out the question of what is automation. Because I think that if a lot of us are asked, what is automation? What is the history of that term, that idea? We would probably associate it with the early days of the Industrial Revolution. We would associate it perhaps with Henry Ford and the assembly line. But really, automation was a product of the 1950s. As I said, in 1947, Ford had internally started using the term, but the term wouldn't be popularized until a man by the name of John Diebold wrote a very popular book called Automation, The Advent of the Automatic Factory in 1952. From there, the term spread like wildfire, and it became one of the most pressing concerns of the period, second only to nuclear annihilation during the Cold War. And so it is an idea that we've really sort of forgotten the importance that it had at this moment. And just 3 months after Disneyland opened, there was a first of three annual congressional hearings dedicated to addressing the issue of automation. And I like to really draw the comparison that automation was very much like the AI panic that we're in at the moment. So there's really strong parallels in how people were talking about the elimination of jobs, about the potential impact on society that are very relevant to this day, and that really speak to the history that Disneyland allows us to see, not only for the history of the theme park and how they made all those rides that you love, but also to understand the history of automation in ways that are really pressing for our daily lives. And so there were a lot of films that were used to explain automation. I particularly love this one. It is very straightforward, called This is Automation from 1955. Very auspicious date for us, since this is the same year that Disneyland opened. And it was produced by General Electric's sales department, basically to explain to people why they should be interested in automation and why it's an important thing for their businesses. So the idea was that in the era of manual labor, you basically used tools and used your hands to make things. If you were going to carve something, you would get a chisel and you would use your hands with a hammer. In mechanization, a machine might be able to help you do that. So the idea, of course, would be that you would put a piece of wood, something, you would pull down a lever on a drill, and it would do that action. Now, what automation offered that was different was the idea that you could put a piece of wood, a raw material, into a system, and this would be moved along various points. And at each point along this track, it would have various actions done onto them. So, for example, if you were making a doll, you would perhaps drill holes for the eye sockets. Then another machine would insert the eyes. all those things that before would have had to been done through different stations in the assembly line and created a lot of chokeholds. So automation was really a unique thing because it basically streamlined the entire process of making in a way that the assembly line of old really could never have done with human labor. And the assumption was as well that with all these machines sort of handing seamlessly to one another goods, you could also eliminate sort of any of the middlemen that were in this equation. Another critical thing of automation was that these systems were able to respond to themselves. Essentially, they could assess what the conditions were on the factory line and take actions accordingly. And the example that people often use to explain automation in the 50s is the example of a thermostat. Basically, that if your air conditioner is running, there is the thermostat, which is checking the temperature constantly of the room. And if it needs to cool the room, it turns on the AC. And when the room reaches the proper temperature, it turns off the AC. And so that's a way of sort of self-regulated control. The example that I'm showing you here on the screen is, for example, that, in a conventional system, in a mechanized system that is, person heating up some soup on the stove would have to test the soup and adjust the knob on the stove to make it hotter or colder. And basically, what automation did was eliminate the person having to be doing these things through a series of sensors and other technologies that knew what the right targets were and could implement those actions. And so automation was really sensationalized in the period as not only the idea, as we see here in this image, that, engines could come in at one end, as you see here on the top, and then a fancy machine could flip them around on their other side and put them back into the line in a different direction. The idea was that these machines could basically move goods and do all the things that needed to be done without humans having to do that in between labor. These machines were run by what was really sensationally called in the period electronic brains. So, what you're seeing on the left is one of the electronic brains at the Cleveland engine plant by Ford that ran these various systems. And what I particularly love is the image on the right here, which is a control system designed by Kinevox, which basically made control systems and sound equipment for cinematography in Hollywood. Well, they produced this very complicated system to basically run the Rocket to the Moon attraction at Disneyland on opening day. And this image actually comes to us from the trade magazine American Cinematographer, which heralded Kinevox's contributions from the film industry to the making of Disneyland in the period. So we begin to see that Disney, in order to provide a streamlined, efficient, consistent, standardized experience began to rely heavily on automation technologies of the period in order to really understand how he could make a theme park that could essentially run itself with all these attractions and rides that could produce sort of a filmic experience perfectly the same every time. And that's certainly what something like this control system allowed. So now I want to dig in a little bit more to Disneyland's automation in order to give you a high-level picture of some of the topics that I discuss in the book and give you a better sense of what was behind the making of Disneyland from this world of engineering that has been largely forgotten. So Disney really, especially if you think of Fantasyland, really built on some of the classic types of rides that you would have found in an amusement park of the period. These, for example, as you see on the screen of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, here taken with an image of Richard Nixon bringing his kids to Disneyland. You have these classic attractions that are often known as dark rides because they occur in a darkened building where a car following a track basically goes through various what are often called gags and effects that basically produce some semblance of thrill for the riders. What Disney definitely did with these attractions was that they really increased the narrative and the sort of cinematic function of them. The idea was that, for example, on Mr. Toad, you driving the car were in the place of Mr. Toad. You weren't peeking into the world of Mr. Toad, but rather you were actually the main character and protagonist in the story. And so what they did is really take the model that these attractions offered and basically tried to produce as much of a cinematic experience from these various rides. A lot of these attractions in their early manifestations, like the commonly referred to as laugh in the dark rides, really were a series of random gags that didn't really cohere into a narrative. They were just there to maybe scare you, to thrill you, to amuse you. And you see here on the right this wonderful image that we have preserved from one of these laugh in the dark rides, where you have basically some of these popular techniques that were used in these attractions. You have a mirror at the end of the track before it turns to make it seem like you're going to have a head-on collision, something that is wonderfully illustrated here on the bottom left with this pattern image. And then you have these undulating bands, which you see here on the right of the image, which are meant to give you a sense of the movement of the car. A lot of the things that if you've ridden Mr. Toad, and especially if you've ridden it recently, you would remember as part of the experience, the idea of going over the dock and the car shaking as it goes over the slats of wood. These are all the types of techniques that were used for these dark rides and that were very clearly patented and neatly sort of exhibited for people to put together. And what I love particularly about Mr. Toad is that it is the perfect dark ride in many ways. It took all of the gags and effects that these patents showed them and basically created the most lush and rich experience that they could create. There's even this wonderful depiction of using a dragon with a light to scare people in these attractions, which of course translates wonderfully to the various demons in the hell scene at the end of the attraction. Now, in making these attractions their own sort of unique Disney-fied versions, they also began to consider what other sort of opportunities could be offered by the technology of the period, especially with a keen eye on what automation technologies and factory technologies could offer. This, my favorite example of this, comes from Peter Pan. I mean, Peter Pan Flight is one of everyone's favorite attractions in the park, and it really captured something unique by basically taking the conventional dark ride that moved on the ground and basically flipping that upside down so that you're hanging from the ceiling. Now, what's really spectacular about Peter Pan Flight is that you actually are going on a warehouse conveyor. You're going on the Cleveland Tramrails monorail system that was used in warehouses. It was used at the Disney studios to move set pieces and so on. It was a very common piece of technology that was in factories like Ford and everywhere, often very easily distinguished by these scalloped markings on the track, which if you ride Peter Pan today, you will still see, which is a really great sort of nod to its history. And this basically was just a way of moving heavy objects through warehouses and factories, which Disney brilliantly decided to transform into a unique experience by translating this into a flying galleon, which I love precisely that these were also called gondolas before when they were used in their context of the factory for basically carrying a driver operating these tools. Now, it's really fascinating to look into this history because here's where we really see this history of collaboration, not just in what would later be called Imagineering, but also outside of Imagineering. We see that Disney's designers, the team of researchers that was trying to piece together the amusement park, the theme park as we know it today, was really working with a host of American industry to try to design these attractions and produce something new in what they were doing. And a lot of this you see by looking at the sales catalog with what they were doing with Peter Pan Flight, where they were actually very carefully taking a lot of the technology that was offered in this manual and translating it into the track system. I particularly love the fact that they opted for the safest form of basically getting power into the attraction by this SAF power bar that they were advertising as a new innovation. And it also reduced the amount of sparks that flew off of the track, which also was pretty good in making sure that, of course, the dark ride stayed dark and was not going to scare anyone with any mysterious sparks coming off of the track. And today, if you go on Peter Pan's flight, you really can see all of these elements down to, of course, that SAF bar that takes the power from the bus bar. You really can see the history of this technology, how it's continued to exist in the park, and how we really still get to enjoy that early sort of foray into the factory that Disneyland achieved. Now, what was really interesting also is that in their collaboration with Cleveland Tramrail, they were also really interested in developing systems that would essentially make sure that two cars in these attractions could never crash into one another. And Cleveland Tramrail had actually considered this previously, and I'm showing you the pattern here, where they had basically created, based on the train system, they had used what is called as a block system, basically with the principle being that if you are in any particular zone or area of track, you basically split the track into various zones. You always make sure that there is a segment of track behind wherever a car is that is, in the case of a dark ride, de-energized. So that is to say that if, for example, the little mine car that I'm showing you here on the screen were to enter zone 3, that part of the track is dead, and so the car would come to a halt and could never hit the car that we see here in this diagram on zone 2. And then when, of course, that car moves to zone 1, that zone 2 goes dark and zone 3 comes back to power. And so this basically did was produce a logic that was taken from the factory and developed by Cleveland Tramrail as a way of ensuring that two cars in any of these rides could never crash into one another. And this really produces the building blocks of the principles of safety that Disney continues to use to this day and that are really industry standards across the entire amusement park industry. Now, these are complicated ideas and it can be tricky to understand how zones work, but that is sort of the gist of this system. And it really came out of these collaborations with people like Cleveland Tramrail, with these broader industry-wide collaborations that were happening as these proto-Imagineers were designing the early park. And so today, when you go on any amusement park ride, any roller coaster, any ride as simple as Small World, you will see a host of different sensors that are basically always checking to make sure that someone, something, today obviously a computer, back then electric relays, those electronic brains, know where every car is in the attraction and what it is doing, particularly at high stress points of the attraction. And so back in the day, early on, these were basically these physical limit switches, which you can still see an example here on the screen at the Giant Dipper roller coaster in Belmont Park in San Diego. You have then these photoelectric switches, basically a line of light that, if interrupted, tells the system that there is something there. And these fancier ones that get added with the creation of the Matterhorn, these inductive proximity sensors, which are basically detecting when there's a heavy metal object above it because it disrupts the magnetic field. If you've ever seen those circles in front of traffic lights, those are basically inductive proximity sensors. They basically sense that there is a large metal object, aka your car, there, and it tells the lights that, hey, maybe you should change in order to get the cars to move. So these technologies, while they seem really nitty-gritty and a part of these very impressive systems that are only at theme parks and factories, actually do exist in our world in ways that we tend to ignore them because we just don't usually have the vocabulary to recognize them. And so part of what I hope a lot of readers will take away from my book is not only a way of appreciating these stories and narratives and these engineering marvels in the amusement parks, but also outside in the world at large, because they really are important to how we move and circulate in our world. Now, the Matterhorn was really important because they wanted to simulate an accurate bobsled ride down the icy slopes of the Matterhorn. So, in order to do that, you wanted to have small, intimate bobsleds, not a long train car like you would have in sort of the classic roller coasters you might see at places like Coney Island. And so this meant that you needed a lot of vehicles moving through this mountain at once. And so to do this, they implemented that idea of the block zones. And what they did is essentially say that they needed brakes rather, since of course a roller coaster is not electric powered in how the cars move. It's just you bring the car up and then you let it fall down with gravity across the track. There was a real need to basically create brake runs that were be able to stop a car if another car was stuck ahead. And so this basically translated the ideas that we first saw with the dark rides into a roller coaster system, really developed in this quite brilliant genius pattern by a man that nobody knows very much on about, Robert W. Gilman, Bob Gilman, who had worked at San Francisco Playland and was a maintenance specialist and really understood how roller coasters worked. And so he created this really fascinating electrical wiring system, essentially, that would take information from sensors and create this logic of brake zones in order to make sure that the Matterhorn could work safely. And the impressive part about all this is that the way the system worked with sensors and all that was the same way that those electric brains at the Ford Cleveland plant worked. They really were just wiring with relays that would create sort of a logic for these systems in an era before the application of computers. As time went by, these systems were developed in the 1960s and 70s, and in particular by the late 60s and implemented in the parks in Disneyland in the mid 70s. You have what are known as programmable logic controllers, which was basically a fancy name for a computer that translated this type of wiring into computer code so that a system run by a computer rather than these giant relay racks could run the entire system of the Matterhorn. And so you have this wonderful history of transformation from these electric relays to these digital systems of PLCs, which today still run many of the attractions that we know and love. A PLC is basically on any amusement park ride that has a moving vehicle in it. And it's a really amazing reminder of the innovation that happened in this period that really set the standard for what amusement parks look like today. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't address in this history of automation, not just how ride control systems work, but also the history of audio animatronics, because I think oftentimes when we think of things like automation, we often think of these images of robots. And of course, when we're talking about Disney and theme parks, we have to think of figures like Abraham Lincoln and all the audio animatronics that fill the park. These were also very much indebted to the history of the factory, because in this period, General Electric had developed a system called record playback, where basically they would get a skilled worker to go on a milling machine and mill a part. For example, a part for an airplane wing. And this would be really detailed, highly technical work. They would basically record the sort of XYZ movements of the worker on magnetic tape, which you see here in this case that the worker is staring at, the technician. And then the skilled worker was no longer needed to do that. And so they could just press play and the machine would magically repeat all the actions that the worker had taken. And so it was a system that was originally developed precisely for taking human movements in the context of a factory and replacing the human with magnetic tape. And so you have all these ads from the period, as we see on the right, from 3M talking about the use of magnetic tape to create these automated milling machines. And of course, this is precisely the system that Walt Disney would adopt to create his audio animatronics, first with the Tiki Room birds, and then, of course, with the human audio animatronics, which of course lent themselves so perfectly to this embodiment of human movement because this is the origins of this technology inherently was basically to be able to reproduce the movement of workers in a factory. And so you have this really interesting history as well of how audio animatronics in some ways are these perfect reflections of the anxieties about the replacement of human workers by machines, And also, of course, what is the future role of humans in these types of technologies, particularly emphasizing the idea of the amount of labor, of course, by humans required to design and implement these various types of shows. And so I hope you can see already the amount that Disneyland, as an amusement park, as a theme park, as an engineering marvel, really has to tell us about the world that we are in and our continued conversations about automation and, of course, about artificial intelligence. Now, I particularly love magnetic tape because it was really sort of the poster child for what automation was in the period. And so I particularly love this cover for Time magazine, where it shows you a computer as this giant sort of entity where the magnetic tape is this giant brain that is floating behind it, because magnetic tape, of course, was the memory of these systems like early computers. And I particularly must show you this cartoon, which I love, which shows you an assembly line. This was produced for a trade magazine. You have an assembly line producing modern cars, and suddenly they become old, basically like Model Ts. And the idea here is, how did I know it was old tape? The sense that someone just switched out the tape so it started producing completely different cars, which really sort of shows you the magic and wonder that was inherent in a lot of these technologies, and why I think that learning about the history of these technologies, especially in their historical context, amplifies these ideas of magic and power that a place like Disneyland had, not just because it awed us by its effects, but because the technology itself was associated in our broader society with these ideas of sort of magical workings of computers and automation. Now, the history of theme parks and automation is one that continues to this day. I think that theme parks are the place where we really get to experience automation firsthand, and also at the scale that these systems actually operate in realms that we often don't get the chance to see unless we work at a factory. And what I mean by that is that, unlike going to, for example, the Ford factory today and seeing how an F-150 is made, you are looking at these massive warehouses filled with machines passing goods from one stage to another seamlessly and making a car from scratch. You can see this, from above on a catwalk, looking down on the process. Disneyland, other amusement parks essentially allow you to ride the assembly line. It allows you to take the POV of the car that's being manufactured and see a view of what that's like. And while that might seem very abstract, that was inherently the idea that was at the core of those early dark rides, when Walt Disney decided that rather than sort of letting you be sort of a guest walking into a story with Snow White or Mr. Toad doing their things, you would actually get to be the character. So the idea was that these little miniature assembly lines were actually, in essence, making you into Mr. Toad by the end of the ride. You were being placed in his position and being sort of created through the various events that happened to you on the assembly line. And really, this is the only place in our world where we get to see automation in its scale, which is to say, all these various machines talking to one another, where we recognize sort of those unique jerks of cars and movements of machines as we get to ride these immersive experiences. And what I love about this history is that even since its early days, amusement parks have been deeply tied to a lot of these industrial technologies that were in some ways far removed. There is there is obviously a reason why so many amusement park rides are, for example, log ride flumes. Like, of course, you would have, as you see here, in a ride vehicle for Splash Mountain, or, of course, something like a mine car ride. Because, of course, the idea was that whether it be logging, as you see on the left, or a mine car going down into a mine to extract goods from the earth, these would be spaces that most viewers would not have access to, and which there was, of course, a cultural understanding of the magnitude, scale, and importance of these places, also tinged with ideas of danger and fear about the hazards of that work. And so for me, it's a really important history to think about the fact that we've made throughout the history of amusement parks, we've translated industry machines and processes like a log flume going into a lumber mill into an attraction for an amusement park. And this is a story that really sort of reaches its sort of crescendo and sort of shifts around in the 70s. And what I love is really how this is handled in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. In this movie from 1971, of course, there's that great scene where you're finally going into Willy Wonka's secretive chocolate factory that no one has ever gone into, no one has ever come out. And you want to know what are, of course, these magical machines that are making all the chocolate. And yet, when you enter into the chocolate room at Willy Wonka's factory, you are not confronted with machines, but rather with a theme park. And I think this is really critical at this moment in time by the early 70s. The machinery that we've come to associate with these theme spaces like Disneyland and the theme park craze that has spread throughout the country, you begin to see that the factory is no longer populated by machines, but rather that the factory has actually become a theme park. So there's this perfect sort of loop from the theme park no longer borrowing from the factory, but the factory actually modeling itself in the theme park's image. And this is particularly relevant in the case of Willy Wonka because it was actually Harper Goff, one of Disney's early Imagineers, who designed an attraction like the Jungle Cruise, who, of course, designed the set for Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And so when we keep that in mind, I can't help but look at this drawing, this sketch for the chocolate waterfall done by Harper Goff. And you look at it, and of course, you immediately see the Jungle Cruise in the riverboat that takes you around the Chocolate River. But of course, you also see elements of the Matterhorn. You see elements of the early Tom Sawyer Island. You also see the various elements of the dark rides, and of course, what had become at this point synonymous with Disneyland. The comparisons to the Jungle Cruise are quite easy to make, as you see in these side by side images of the two, where you really have the idea that the factory here is not just a sort of mythical wonderland because Willy Wonka is this mythical, magical creature. It actually is that the factory has now become amusement park rides themselves. And I really love that slippage because then you have in the 70s as well a magazine like Popular Mechanics saying, in relation to the Roosevelt Island Fair tram, saying airborne commuters take a Disneyland ride to work. And what I love about that is that while yes, maybe they're thinking about the sky buckets, they're really thinking about the idea that to ride this machinery is really to go to Disneyland. That the association with Disneyland, with theme parks, is that you are riding these impressive, awe-inspiring machines. And this history is really something that I think powerfully continues to this day. I'm showing you here an image from loading at Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey, which you can ride, for example, at you can ride at Universal Studios, at Orlando, or in Hollywood. And what I love about this attraction is that it continues this history of the theme park being a sort of mediator in bringing technologies locked away in the factory into our realm where we can experience them as a form of entertainment and amusement. So, of course, the robotic arms that manufacture so many of our cars, so many of our goods, are what you get to take for a ride on Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey, as we see on this image on the left, on the right. It is basically a KUKA arm, which is a robotics manufacturer, which has been joined with this basically like a dark ride system where you're going along a track, stopping at various sites, and getting this sort of modern dark ride that is produced, of course, by the same technology of the factory. So it's this moment of updating these technologies and saying, if our cars are manufactured by these robotic arms, then what can these arms offer us for new experiences? And by virtue of doing that, we're getting to understand how our technology works, how it functions, and getting to experience it as part of that magic of these machines that usually are only relegated to what we get to see in press images of factories and so on. There is this real sort of how it's made interest of getting to peek behind the curtain and see how the things in our world are made by actually getting to ride these machines. And so, if Peter Pan's flight in 1955 allowed you to go on a warehouse conveyor and make that into a magical journey of flight, in many ways, Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey is doing the same thing. It's updating that experience and saying, well, now we're making cars with these arms, so you'll get to experience what it's like to take a ride on those machines. And so this history is really important to how we understand our amusement spaces, but also how we can use these spaces to learn about our world and the machines that really control so much of our lives. I particularly think that Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railroad is one of the greatest attractions in the park because it's a perfect contemplation of so many of these ideas. It goes back to Disney's roots in his love for trains, of course, and it begins wonderfully as a really, it's sort of trying to fool you into believing that you're going on a really conventional track-based ride. You can even see a painted track on the floor as if you are going onto this very conventional train. But as the ride progresses, the cars all split up and you are on an automated, autonomously guided vehicle taking you along the various scenes. And what I particularly love about this attraction is that it leans into the history of automation and the factory that we have become so familiar with the theme park. One of my favorite moments in this attraction, which is not in the Orlando version, but is in the Disneyland version, is that sign that says doors open automagically towards you, really leaning into that perfect union of magic and automation that I have come to know so well in my research. But of course, if that weren't enough, if these details did not convey the point well enough, the final sort of climactic scene in this attraction is that you enter this awe-inspiring, hellish factory where, of course, I even love you have an overhead conveyor carrying various things along, and then you are threatened by being sort of pushed seamlessly into the very on the nose, the Smasher, inspiring fear. But of course, don't worry, Mickey's going to save the day. And what does Mickey do? He turns the entire factory into a calm, placid amusement park. So saving you from the technologies of the factory and bringing you back to the theme park perfectly safe and sound. In some ways, this sort of captures much of the thesis of my book of how Disneyland really, in this moment of great panic about automation, about the impact of technology in our worlds, really gave people a way to peek behind the curtain and understand these technologies and become familiar with them, and also translate so many of these technologies into a leisure experience. And so this, as we've seen, is a history that continues to this day in how amusement parks, theme parks help us to understand the technologies, the systems that exist in our world. I keep thinking, of course, about the new so-called robotic character of Olaf, which is AI powered, another moment where the theme park is beginning to translate these ideas that are so much in our minds today into interactions that we can have as a reflection of our broader world. And so throughout the chapters of my book, I basically tell these little mini stories that are associated directly centered on certain rides, certain key events and moments to really understand this history of automation and how it's really been fundamental in how we thought about our places of leisure, but also our world today, how technology controls our lives, the anxieties that automation has spurred in people about our role as humans, and the way in which Disneyland as a theme park has really mediated these conversations and allowed us to take these factory attractions for a ride. And so it's a really sort of compelling history that I hope readers will leave with a sense of wanting to ask questions about the technology that runs their world, but also to have a new sort of language to talk about this technology, to be able to talk about sensors and recognize them, whether it be at Disneyland or on the road, and to be able to understand some of the key systems that have formulated these experiences. And so, as was said, the book was out now. Princeton University Press has done an amazingly beautiful job at all the images. There are 200 images in the book. So it is really a treat to go through it. I am always impressed when I opened it, even though I wrote it and worked very hard to put all the images together. But it is really a fascinating way of learning about the history of the theme park and also technology. I have a QR code here for a link to the book, and it is available on Amazon, at independent bookstores, and wherever else books are sold. So you can get it as a hard copy or as a Kindle. It is truly quite a beautiful object, and so I'm very happy to be able to share this work really for the first time with you all here tonight. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to answering some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Betancourt, for this marvelous presentation. And now we will open it up for questions. If you have any questions for Professor Betancourt and you have not already entered them into the Q&A box, please go ahead and do that now. And let's see, Mona, did we have any questions that came in during the presentation?
Yes, yes, we did. And thank you so much. I was just so moved by this talk because I had never really considered the factory aspect of this. And, one question we had was about the Goodyear People Mover. Is that something that people could go see at that time? Was that was that created by Goodyear, the company itself, or is that something that people could still go ride? We had a couple questions about that. Are some of
Yeah.
these tours, like the factory, like the River Rouge tour, are these still in existence or, you know,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, great question. You can still go to the River Rouge and you can, I think that the only thing they do manufacture there are the F-150s now. But you can go and you walk over sort of a catwalk and get to see the tour. I did it probably like a decade ago. And you can still go to Greenfield Village. You can still go to the museum itself, which is really great. So you can have really a lot of you can definitely have the modern version of everything that Disney got to see on that visit. And he had actually been to the River Rouge multiple times and to the museum, had even done drawing lessons for kids there at their museum. So he really was very familiar with that site. And yeah, you can certainly see these things today. The question, oh, you can even sometimes you can even also sign up to go see Amazon fulfillment warehouses as a factory tour. They sometimes actually open that up for guests to go take a tour. So there really are a
Ah,
lot of really interesting factory tours that you could do, perhaps even closer to you than you might think. Great question about the Goodyear People Mover. So the People Mover is no longer with us at Disneyland, sadly. It is at Walt Disney World. Um, it is basically based on the Ford Magic Skyway, which was built for the 1964 World's Fair. Technologically, that is its origin. The idea of the Ford's Magic Skyway was that you got to board a brand new Ford car and take it on drive. That really was not really relevant for the amusement park. And so when they looked for another sponsor, the whole thing about the People Mover is that was basically being moved along by a bunch of tires along
hmm.
the track. And so Goodyear sponsored it. And of course, they use Goodyear tires, which Goodyear very much promotes in all of their PR from the period, which I definitely discuss about in the book because it's pretty great. And I got to work with the Goodyear archive at the University of Akron. So that was an extra treat. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. I was a little kid, but I do remember the People Mover, so I was glad to have experienced that. Okay, we have more questions. Um, since Walt Disney is into the automation, how much How many hours and how much cost did it take to make this all happen? Is there any figure that anybody's even come up with?
Um, there are various figures. There's figures for like the initial costs of the park and the way that it ballooned. It is quite interesting, perhaps most relevant to the history of the attractions themselves and the automation. One of the original general manager for the park, C.V. Wood, attended various of the amusement park professional conferences at the period. And I remember that we have all the proceedings, so we have all those basically like the minutes of what was said at the conference. And it's so funny because at first he basically says, one year he says, well, we're not really inventing new rides. We're just sprucing them up in the way that only Walt Disney can do. And then the next year he sort of comes along and he's like, yeah, each of these rides would cost you between like 150 to $200,000. So there's no way that you could buy them if you tried to do them. So it's a sort of interesting history to try to parse that out. I'm sure somewhere in Disney's record books there would be a cost to the automation, but that actually answers a really interesting question, which is, you know, with all the panic that there was in the period about automation, one of the things that really was sort of foregrounded is that automation was really expensive to do. You had to buy all these machines. They of course had to be basically custom designed to what you were doing. And so not every factory could just simply automate. And they really tried to like expand the idea of what automation meant to be like processes and streamlining to really suggest that it wasn't just about the gadgets, which were quite expensive. And so that's a really interesting part of like these questions of cost. You actually think that automation is a cost saving endeavor, but it actually could be prohibitively expensive
Hmm.
for a lot of factories and of course for what amusement park leaders wanted to do with it.
That's very interesting. And that when you were talking about having access to the proceedings, there's quite a few questions about how you researched your book.
Yeah.
Yeah, one person would like to know, did you have access to the Disney archives?
Yeah, so basically the way that I was looking at the book was that I was looking very broadly at how Disney was interacting with a lot of the industry and understanding the sort of state of these technologies. So oftentimes, a lot of the questions that I was looking for, I had answers outside of the Disney archives because there were questions about the state of the field that, of course, Disney would have not necessarily preserved. And so, for example, I worked with the remains of the Cleveland Tramrail archive to think about Peter Pan.
Mm.
I worked with the Goodyear archive. Um, I have all the archives listed in the back of the book, so I could start rattling them off sort of from memory. But like, I went to the Museum of Science and Industry to try to reconstruct the various exhibits that Disney would have seen. I worked extensively with the Henry Ford, with their archives, with the Ford archives, both at the museum and also with the corporation, General Motors, the New York Public Library for all their World's Fairs records for Disney's developments. I think those are some of the highlights. And so it really was, this book was a 7 to 8 year long process. And a lot of that was certainly interrupted or let's say slowed down by the pandemic. Um,
Mm.
but it was really a moment where, if I was giving a conference in Cleveland, I was going to go look at the Cleveland Tramrail archives. If I was giving a conference paper in New York, I was going to stop at the New York Public Library. So I really sort of was able to do a lot of this work by sort of taking research opportunities whenever they showed up and piecing together the story from places that a lot of people haven't looked at. So it was really exciting. And of course, talking to a lot of former Imagineers at various stages of the history of the park, because sadly, the history of the engineering of the park is probably the least discussed and the least well preserved. So it was a really amazing time with some really wonderful, wonderful human beings that I got to spend a lot of time talking about like the nitty gritty about the Matterhorn sensors or brakes, because it wasn't that the answer specifically was important, but in order to answer my bigger picture questions, I needed to know these specifics. And so it was a really exciting moment to get to understand how you could think more broadly of where answers might stand. A lot of wonderful family archives also that were shared to me as people heard about the project or were contacted by me or others.
Yeah, and you said you were working on this book for 8 years. How long did it actually take you to do the research for this book?
Yeah, it was basically a 7 year period of research and writing.
Hmm.
I began going to the park in January of 2018, where I was really trying to figure out what I wanted to write about and sort of like coming to terms with the automation side of things, which probably took several months to get a sense of where I was heading. And so that was when I then began to go and start to piece together what types of questions I wanted to ask, what types of questions there would be answers to, and then began that process of the archival research. One of the good things that did come out of the pandemic was that archives were also very willing to help digitize things and send me scans of things as I
Mm.
needed it. So that was also a really exciting part. I mean, I think that a lot of from just purely even just talking about the proceedings of amusement park, the National Association of Amusement Parks, Pools and Beaches. Um, there's not one place that has all of those archives, not even today it's called IAPA. They don't even have necessarily all those proceedings. So I was basically finding them scattered across amusement park collections that happened to have them because, they got them in the mail every year and stuff like that. So it's really been a lot of detective work
Mm.
for this project, which has been extremely exciting and extremely frustrating. It different depends when you ask me in the 7 year process.
Right. Well, I have a question then about
Mm,
the patents that you highlight in the book.
yeah.
To me, because I work in government publications and we have the Patent Resource Center here, Patent and Trademark Resource Center, and I'm just fascinated by them. And I see it occurred to me, I was going to ask, how people made money off these patents, but it occurs to me that the larger field of amusement parks, they all use the same patents. Is that what's happening? Like the early patents for the sensors and that kind of situation. Are those all like common patents that all amusement parks use?
Yeah, I would definitely say that one of the things that my research really illuminated, and that doesn't make it fully into this book, is that the amusement park industry was actually really hyper professionalized throughout this period. Even before Disney came on the scene, they were really, like I mentioned, they had an annual conference
Mhm.
that would, the records were kept very well there with the proceedings. And so there were really like very clear movers and shakers that people would turn to, and they would learn a lot from their presentations, their annual presentations. So, for example, every year they would send people around the country and even to Europe as well to look at what new attractions people were implementing in their parks and so on. And so I think that there were a lot of people, there were a lot of figures that Disney was looking at for patents that were definitely like the big names in the industry. And that, of course, whenever Disney patents sort of a new development to those rides, those patents are always cited. So for me, a lot of this process was always looking at if there was a Disney patent, who were they engaging with? Who were they citing in the patents? Who were they not citing in the patents and why? So that was a really interesting part of looking at this history of how like this knowledge was being transmitted, which was partially through like the trade networks, but also in a very diligent way through a lot of the patents and publications that they were putting out there. And Disney was very um, meticulous about patenting whatever they could. So when you don't have a Disney patent, like for example, we don't have a patent from the early dark rides, that's because they were essentially using basically trade knowledge about dark rides that
Mm.
were well established and so on throughout these various patents and through additional improvements on them. And all the Disney patents were basically, no matter who the inventor is, they're always assigned to Walt Disney. Um,
Mm. Oh, okay.
what part of Walt Disney they get assigned to is a fascinating little story, whether it's WED Enterprises, which is today Imagineering, whether it's the studio and so on, that varies and is a very interesting story. But yeah, there's a great pattern story there that I'm writing something else about separately because
Oh,
it's its own nitty-gritty history. Yeah.
well, that answers another question we received because, well, maybe there's probably more, but somebody wanted to know if you stumbled upon any new questions while writing this book that are leading you into your next direction of research. So if that's possibly one.
Yeah, that's definitely one. There are a few questions. I would say that I wrote a lot when I started writing the book that did not make it into the book. I basically a book's worth of material that didn't make it into the book, which is finding different lives now. But yeah, there was a lot of interesting questions. I worked a lot with the original site report. Disney commissioned the Stanford Research Institute to basically produce a report telling them where should we build this theme park. And I look at the ways in which a lot of the techniques for sort of surveying land and detect and finding sites came out of questions about fears of nuclear attack that this company, the Stanford Research Institute, which was a Cold War think tank, had actually developed for basically advising industry how to avoid being a prime target for nuclear attack. And so there's been really and that's taken me to like classified documents and
Hmm.
like government archives. So it's been a really interesting history. I'm also really interested in the history of training at both Disneyland and elsewhere. So I really would like to work more on the history of like corporate training in this period.
Hmm. That's fascinating. Okay, excellent. Um, there's several comments about how much people have enjoyed this presentation, how much they've learned. Somebody who just went yesterday,
Hmm.
she just wanted to comment on how much she's enjoyed this presentation and also was wondering how they created, and I don't know if you'll know this or not, the effect of simulating being on a pier on the Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. Do you have any ideas on
Yeah,
that?
that's the very simple thing of they just like put there's like wooden slats essentially on the floor. And so as you roll over it, it gives you that sense of bouncing on the slats of the pier. So it's
Ah,
basically a variation on one of those effects that was in that great pattern, which was that pattern was sort of like a handbook of all the effects that were like easy to do. And what I love about Mr. Toad, I mentioned that it's sort of like the best dark ride because it brings in all the stops. Snow White, by comparison, if you look at the original Snow White attraction that opened, that one basically had no effects. It was basically just going through a painted scenery and seeing various scenes without many of the types of gags that you would expect. But Mr. Toad was one of the prime ones that they focused on, so they had a lot more time to basically develop that one and sort of make it the dark ride to end all dark rides is how I like to think about it. So it's pretty great. A lot has all these rides were redone in the 80s when they redid Fantasyland. So a lot has changed and it's hard to like as a historian, I'm very careful of what is original and what's not, and when you're thinking about a particular period. But Mr. Toad, you can definitely write it and get a real strong gist of what the original ride looked like and all these various things that were put into play for these effects. So that's a great question. I hope you continue to recover and that you enjoyed Mr.
yeah,
Toad.
yeah, I know. That's great. I mean, I personally love the Peter Pan and ride,
Mhm.
and because it's so magical, you feel like you're literally floating above the city,
Yeah.
and to learn that it's based on, an overhead factory, moving piece of technology, I had no idea. What was that one called? That was
That was the Cleveland Tramrail
the
one. Yeah.
Cleveland Tramrail. Yeah, I think I like that one a lot.
That's one of the places I really started my research on because I thought it was such a and I always talk about it because I feel like it just like it clicks like this direct association between the sort of factory technology and the experience. And so it's a really lovely example and shows really like the magic of these factory machines. Yeah.
Yeah, I had no idea. Really, except for in LA, if you grew up in LA, they had the Anheuser-Busch factory that you used to be able to take that tour through. And I was like, as a kid, they took us there, for school. And in retrospect, that was odd. But now I think about it, uh, that was a really cool use of that same technology, just
Yeah.
going through the factory. So that's so neat. Okay, so let's see. Okay, everybody wants to know what your favorite ride is. And um, I would be really derelict if I did not ask. I don't know if it's the Runaway Railway or if it's, um, what do you
You
think?
know, it's hard for me to pick favorites, but I feel like I have to say that it's the Matterhorn. Um, which is funny because I I think especially as a Walt Disney World Floridian, um, it's sort of a weird one also because we don't have it. But I learned so much about the park through learning about the Matterhorn, and I've learned so much about how amusement parks work by learning about the Matterhorn. I could I could teach the entire history of rides just with the Matterhorn. And so I have to say that I think that if I were to pick a ride that I think in some way manifests Walt Disney's vision for what this all could be, it would have to be Pirates of the Caribbean.
Hmm.
Because I feel like in terms of sweeping you away, taking you to another world, and through, a classic conveyor system of industry like the log flume, it really does everything perfectly in many ways, and has such a rich history of, the centrality of like debates about, what is too much raping and pillaging, and has been such a critical sort of like talking point throughout the park's history for so many reasons. And I do think it sort of is another ride that you could really captures the sort of like the theming immersion thesis of the Disney history.
And that's so cool because now I understand what the flume ride is
Hmm.
like. Because I've wondered about the watcher rides, the ones that like Splash Mountain or any of those log jam rides. And I hadn't really thought about like It's a Small World or Pirates of the Caribbean as being a flume ride, but I guess
Yeah.
tracks on water, that's just another aspect. So that's fascinating. Okay, so I think I agree with you on Pirates. Uh, but and I do have so many questions about the Haunted Mansion because that is actually my favorite.
Mhm.
But I can see it's just the conveyor belts. I mean, I'm trying to figure out now which were used, like the zones. Um, but like I'm trying to think about like Madame Leota. Is there anything magical or scientific there other than a projection? Or is that
Yeah. I mean, I think so it's really interesting. I think Haunted Mansion is a really interesting part in this history because for both the sort of technical side of the equation and also for the sort of the theming side of the story. I mentioned this whole idea that, in the dark rides, you're taking the perspective of the leading character essentially and getting this experience. Haunted Mansion is not that. You are not ever discussed as a ghost. I mean, you could be potentially a ghost, but of course, you are not part of that world. You are coming to visit. You are a visitor in this space. And so, in that sense, it's the most cinematic in the idea that you're sort of
mm,
walking into a world that's happening around you. It's like you're walking through a film, but no one's really paying attention to you in that sense. And what I love about that is that the Omnimover, which is the ride system
mm,
for the Haunted Mansion, is really it's a camera. It's going on a track just like a Hollywood camera if you're using a dolly might go on a track. And it's really very carefully leading your vision to certain scenes and moments as a narrator talks in your ear. It is sort of like it's like watching Sunset Boulevard. Like you're getting this really lush narration and you have
mm,
this sort of cocoon around you where your vision is restricted. So you're not supposed to be looking except at where you're looking at. And one of the things that I particularly love about the Haunted Mansion, to bring up Leota, is that, of course, Leota is the seance where you are being invited to actually see the ghost. And until that moment, you have never seen a physical ghost. Until that moment,
mm.
you've only seen sort of the floating candelabra or the guy trying to get out of the tomb. But it's a very careful and smart play on both that dialogue between the ride and the experience. And it was actually the ride system was very, I think Bob Gurr put it very casually, like, oh, we ripped that off from the Futurama attraction by General Motors from the
Hmm.
1939 World's Fair. So it was very much based on this very classic early World's Fair experience with, I mean, a lot of like developments in how the vehicles actually got to move extensively, but very much drawing on this like classic World's Fair ride experience that was very, very popular at the time.
Yeah, it sounds like Disney got so many ideas from World's Fairs, which would be a
Mhm.
fascinating book on its own. I mean, I don't think I realized how elaborate they were until I've seen, a lot of pictures and images of, the San Francisco World Fair. I mean, that's quite amazing. So I can see where that there'd be a crossover. And then some people, I have two questions about um, whether or not you have seen original drawings of the rides. One wants to know if you've seen them, the ones that are stored at the Walt Disney Imagineering in Glendale. And also if you've been to the San Francisco Disney Family Museum. I believe they have dioramas of every Disneyland ride. So I was wondering if you had visited either of those
Yeah.
places or checked out
Yeah,
those.
definitely been to the Walt Disney Family Museum. Um, Yes, I love the diorama. I also love the diorama has like multiple periods of time of Disney history, and so I'm always like, wait, what period? When are we? And then I'm like, okay, it's like ideal Disney. But no, I love the Family Museum. It's such a great depiction of the whole history of the studio and Walt Disney and the emergence of the theme park. There's really great things. I've worked in the past with them to get sources and to check things. Um, and what is it? The one thing that I haven't done is look precisely at the Imagineering library because I know that a lot of technical answers probably lie in the Imagineering library. Um, I have got a chance to see a lot of images and documentation and drawings of the original of a lot of the original attractions, as well as like the original proposal for the park and things like that. Ironically, a lot of those things are in part of the writing that did not make it into this book, but there's definitely
Hmm.
sort of fragments of that. So more ahead as the
Yeah.
Disney journey continues.
Yes. More part two. Okay, great. Thank you so much. We just have a couple more questions. I know we're kind of
Yeah.
getting short on time. Um, Somebody would like to know, in your research, is
Mhm.
there a least reliable attraction at Disneyland? Now, I know we've all gone and there's always one that shut down during the day, but is there a least reliable attraction? Not to be
Well,
negative
I
there, but
No, 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 no. I mean, it's a trust me, this is like a priority for Disney. Disney wants to
yeah,
know
I know.
these things more than
Yeah.
anyone. Um, it's a really interesting question. Because of the fact that a lot of the ways which Disney works and many theme parks is they talk about theoretical hourly capacity, which is like if everything's operating just fine, like how many people can you get through at a time? Ironically, one of the most efficient rides in the park is Haunted Mansion because it's just
Hmm.
constantly moving. You're constantly getting people on. There's constant movement. The same thing for a ride like Pirates of the Caribbean. Um, I'm trying to think if I don't really I don't want to be mean to any of my darlings
No.
and say that one of them is least reliable. It's
You
actually
should
really funny
rephrase
because
that. You
as
rephrase that
old
thing.
as old as the Matterhorn is, it's from 1959. As
Ah.
storied as its history is, and as many times as I've ridden it, and I've ridden the Matterhorn a lot. I don't even want to try to count. I have never um had a had any form of breakdown on the
Hmm.
Matterhorn, which I'm actually annoyed about. Like I've gotten stuck on Space Mountain like 3 or 4 times.
Right.
I think the last time it happened, I was like, okay, I've done this a few times now.
Right.
But ironically, it's never happened with the Matterhorn, and I feel like it's something about my special relationship with the mountain. But
With
um, yeah, so it's, even a ride that you would think that it's pretty old, it has this long history, it's still always treated me very well. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Somebody says they think it's probably Indiana Jones because it's always
You
down
know,
when they're
if I
going.
was if I was gonna say I was not going to touch Indy. I actually don't talk about Indy in the book, because I sort of stop in the mid 80s because it seems like the organic moment where this history sort of matures and reaches a sort of stable point. So I don't know indie in its depths, and so I wasn't going to talk ill about poor indie, but I understand it often is down.
It does seem to go down a little bit more than the others. Um, okay, let's see. Okay, this is from Stephanie, our hostess.
Mhm.
Is it true that certain scents are pumped into areas of the park in order to enhance experience? Sorry, these are just a little bit behind the scene
Yeah.
ones now.
Yeah, um it's really funny. I think we often try to overstate how much control over us Disney has. And I think people will talk about the fact that there were these Smellitzers um, by one of the places where they make candy, where they pumped it out onto, it was meant to pump out to Main Street. Seems like that hasn't been working for a very long time. It's at the Crystal Palace. Um, there are of course rides that will use some sense. Like I think about like the Monsters Inc. ride, but in very obvious ways. I had a interesting conversation with a friend of mine though who worked um, at the parks a long time ago. And his first job at the park was actually making popcorn, and he was stationed by the railroad um on Main Street at the start of Main Street. And I remember asking him early on basically a version of this question, and he was like, no, but I mean, if
No.
I saw that a train was pulling up, I definitely made some fresh popcorn because I knew that people would smell it and they would come and buy it. And I was
Ah,
like star employee basically
yeah,
because I was, and so it
yeah,
was one of those moments where I think a lot of those things are overstated, but I think that
yeah.
certainly like there are certain things that will definitely guide us
Or legend
in
or
certain ways.
lore. Yeah,
Yes.
that's um okay, so that's great. I have two questions about current innovation at
Hmm.
Disneyland.
Yeah.
Um, so I know your book kind of stops at a certain period, but are you aware of what innovations in automation is Disney looking at? Um, are they working on any particular focus? Are they kind of revamping older things, or what's going on there now, in your
Yeah. I mean,
perspective?
no, it's really interesting. I mean, I think the history of Disney Imagineering has been one of, working. I think I always say that there's like these ebbs and flows of like working broadly with industry, being more sort of like inward looking, and sort of like their own research and development. And so this is ebb and flowed. I mean, it's very clear, I think, um, one of the ways that we get a very clear sense of this without spilling any secrets is what patterns Disney. And of course, also, I think we always, if someone else in the industry is doing it, I think we need to pay attention to that also, because I'm sure that, like anything else in this world, Disney's also going to be interested in it. But I think that AI is definitely a really interesting
Mm.
horizon. Now with, as I mentioned in passing, the releasing of the Olaf, they're they're saying like he's not an audio animatronic, he is a robotic character because as an AI powered character, he is something else. He is walking around the park freely, all these things,
Mm.
freely, whatever that means, of course, within a sort of very controlled situation. But I think that things powered by AI are definitely making their ways into amusement parks in basically every level of the operation, in ways that I think at first were probably more invisible and will become more present. Disney did file a patent, I think it was back in 2015, basically to assess like biometric data on like what your emotional response is to an attraction so that it could
Mm.
basically adjust the attraction for you. And so I can definitely see a place down the line, maybe like who knows how far down the line, but maybe in the 5 to 10 year range where, rides can respond to how you are behaving. And also maybe that memory of how you've responded can travel with you across park visits, across various attractions, all these things, so that maybe, AI Olaf could ask you like, how was Pirates of the Caribbean? Things like that. So I think that
Right.
that's definitely a horizon that I would say we should look at, because I think one of the interesting things that AI offers um, is that probably you can do really interesting things like that to customize experiences for guests in a way that doesn't necessarily require building a wholly new ride. It's stuff that you can sort of implement to existing rides. And so I think there's a lot of that that's possible already, even without AI, that parks are doing. I was very impressed being at Walt Disney World, and every time I got off a ride, like it knew that I had been on it and had sent me my picture because of Bluetooth. And that system worked seamlessly there, and that was not anything magical or facial recognition or anything like that. So
Wow. Well, this has just been so fascinating. We're running out of time, and I just wanted to um, one more question. So you are a professor.
mhm.
So are you going to use this book as a textbook for one of your classes, or is this?
I've been thinking about it. I never assign anything that I've written myself. I try not to. It seems like too much. But, I do teach a large class on Disneyland that is really about thinking about the built environment, architecture, art, and, you know, the automation, like the how things work, the engineering. Um, and there really is no other thing like it. So I think I might have to actually use at least parts of it in my class, because I think it is a an exciting way of getting students to understand what my research has been and also like how I see the park. But I'm definitely considering it because it'll be really exciting to be able to like dive into the chapters and expand each one with all the other images I've taken and all the other material that I have that didn't make it into the book. So that'll be hopefully exciting if I choose to do that. But in any case, I'll be definitely teaching my Disneyland class in the fall, so I'm excited to at least be able to teach it after the book came out.
Oh, I'm sure it's waitlisted for a long. I mean, I'm sure that's one of the most popular offerings. And okay, the final question is, so you have a really unusual background, CV. So, how did your subject matter in the medieval ages get into research about Disneyland? Like, how did you? I can see the art aspect, and I can see bits and pieces, but what would you say? Um, how did it all come together for you?
Yeah, I think oftentimes I say that my students probably think that as an art historian, I sit around and look at art in a museum. But in reality, so much of what I do is really working as a historian when I'm thinking about the deep past. Like, if I'm looking at a work of art from the Middle Ages, I have no idea where this object came from, how it worked, what its use was, because art, of course, was not just to be hung on a wall, but to be used in some capacity, oftentimes with religious undertones for maybe rituals and so on. And so for me, I've always been someone who has looked at the entire experience of works of art. So I have, for example, one of my books is on gospel books, basically portions
Mhm.
of the Bible that are used in the what is the Mass in the Greek Orthodox world in the Middle Ages. And for me, that book is all about understanding how the art in these books, how the chant marks to chant the gospels out loud, how the art and architecture of the church in which it would have been used, how all these things came together to create a whole experience. And so for me, I think in many ways, like Disneyland is not that different. I really have always been thinking about how things come together across disciplines and areas to create this entire, what we would call today, an immersive experience. And I was talking once to an Imagineer, um, and I told him I said I'm a medievalist. I'm working on this book on Disney, and he said to me, "Why would you need to work on Disneyland when you have Gothic cathedrals?" And I really love that, because that is actually
Yeah,
like
it's true. Yeah.
that is actually how I teach for a seminar for grad students, where we really go from basically like medieval churches to Disneyland in Las Vegas, because I'm interested in these places that try to tell you you're no longer on Earth, you're somewhere else,
Hmm.
you're day behind, and you're in some sort of heavenly or divine space. And this is separate from the outside world. And I think that's what for me really strikes a chord for places like this that try to unsettle time and space and take us somewhere else. I think it's a really like has a long, long history that's not just about amusement parks or theme parks or World's Fairs, but it really comes down to special places in various cultures throughout history that we've sort of demarcated as being special and different and otherworldly in some capacity.
That's beautiful. That's a wonderful spot. I hate to leave you. I mean, we're at time now, but thank you so much. This has been truly inspiring, and we just want to thank you and wish you all the success on your book. I'm sure it's going to be quite popular. And I'm just going to share our last slide, and thank you so much for being with us tonight. This has been so fun.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Professor, for your marvelous presentation. I just have to say, yes, Pirates of the Caribbean. It is not a trip to Disneyland until I get that whiff of dank cement
Of
water.
of funk. Yeah,
The
musty
best.
funk.
Thank you so much again for the presentation, and thank you, Mona, for moderating the Q&A. Thank you all for attending. And if you enjoyed the program, please take a moment to answer our tiny little 4-question survey, which pops up right after you exit. Follow the instructions at the end to sign up for our news and events mailing list, and you can hear more. Thank you so much.